You gonna want a sandwich? Or you
No.
just eat after your class?
No, I'm starting. Can you get me a glass of water?
Oh yeah? Is it this one?
Hi, Professor. I'm testing my mic. Can you hear me? Yes?
Just a minute. Let me. I'm going to be admitting people for a minute here.
Okay.
In the meantime, let me say, you may have noticed the link came about. Well, it came this morning, but that's about when I will usually send it to you. I have had some unfortunate experiences during the summer of people, showing up and in my Zoom meetings that don't belong there and sharing all kinds of inappropriate things on the screen and so on. So to avoid that, I do use this admit feature, and I don't share the, I don't like to share the link to the class too far in advance. So I will tend to, I have this course twice in a row, so it'll probably be around before 11 is usually when I'll send it. If I haven't sent it by like 20 minutes to, someone send me an email because I've forgotten, but I will almost never forget. But though it has happened once or twice. I'm still admitting people. In the meantime, you might want to consider, I have my list here, whether you want to volunteer for today.
I'd like to volunteer.
Lynn would like to volunteer. Anyone else?
I'll volunteer too.
Who is I?
Karen.
And
Okay,
Rima.
find you. Okay, who else?
I would volunteer too, Aziz.
Okay, Abdulaziz. You just go by
I'll volunteer.
Abdul or
You could call me Aziz if you want.
Aziz? Okay. Who else was speaking?
Leah.
Leah. So we have 4. 2 more?
And Karen.
Yes, I've got you, Karen.
Oh, okay.
Did you get me?
I did not, so I have you now. Rima?
Yeah. Yes.
1 more.
Professor, I came in late, but I guess I'm volunteering.
Okay, Hala. Okay, good.
Yes.
My electricity just cut. It might cut for some of you, so I'm gonna, again, wait just a moment. Until it comes back on. Okay, it just came back on. Okay, we're back. Let me share my screen. Here we go. Let me see. Anything to talk about first? Do you have any questions before we get started?
Nope.
No? Okay. Some have asked about when the, I don't know if I've said this in this section or not, but according to the schedule, your first annotations are due this weekend. I have, however, decided to delay creating the Dropbox folders until next week for reasons that if I do it too early, I'll have to delete lots of people who end up either dropping or changing sections or coming in. During the summer, I had people 3 weeks in still showing up. So the longer I delay it, the less kind of work I have to do and then undo. So I'm going to leave it until next week. That just means you should do your annotations, but just hold on to them. I will look at them when I look at the next ones. The other question that I very often get is, how far do we need to be in our annotations? This course is a course for you. It's not for me. I've done this many times. I know most of these things. I do enjoy it, and I do get a lot out of hearing what you guys have to say and think. But it's not for me, it's for you. So I'm going to go as fast as I feel we should go so that you get the maximum amount out of these texts. Some professors I know, they act as if the more they can say that you've read, although you probably haven't, the more they've achieved. I only feel like I've achieved something if you've actually read it and we've talked through it and you understand it and digest it. And people can read these books. These books are rich. They've been around for hundreds of years and they will be around for thousands more. And people will read them and learn new things. You can go on forever in these books. They're full of interesting things. Now, we're not going to go that deeply, but we certainly don't want to go too fast, such that we don't find the interesting things and we don't practice the skills we're supposed to be practicing in interpretation and so on. So that's just to say, I've got nowhere I feel like I need to get or to be, and you shouldn't either. And we'll just go, and if we're going too slowly, let me know that. If you're getting too bored, or you know all the stuff, we'll speed up. Or if we're going too fast, particularly, we'll slow down. So where do you need, that all comes back to the question, where do you need to be in your annotations? You need to essentially be to the end of whatever we're working on at the moment. So if you look at the schedule, I haven't entirely updated it. We haven't even got into the first 19 pages. We're just starting that today. So for today, I would really expect you to have done the annotations and to have read through page 19, right? Some of you have gone beyond that, good for you. Do try to do the annotations before we discuss, because that's when you'll get the most out of it, right? You'll know. I encourage all of you to ask me anything you do not understand. And there may be numerous things you do not understand, even individual terms or words or phrases that won't occur to me. I won't explain them. So if you have that question, probably many other people have that same question. So in other words, let's just have a good conversation and feel free to ask all you need to make the most out of these texts. And when I say I'm going to grade the annotations, I will look to the annotations to the end of whatever section we happen to be on. You should have finished, right? Another question I got in the last section was, can we add your professor, your annotations as we go through there? Well, I'd say you shouldn't rely on my annotations. The annotations are for, your annotations are for you. But if I say something and you want to add it, or you didn't notice something was important and you want to add it, absolutely feel free. But if you just copy my annotations, I'll notice that. Yeah. So any no questions? Yeah, or if there's a question about any of that. If not, we finished the going through the quiz last time a little bit. We just used that as kind of a doorway to start talking about some of these themes. Now in this session, we're gonna look at the text. We're gonna do this a lot, right? Kind of two things we do.
Professor,
Yes, go ahead.
there's someone you didn't let in, Lily. She's in the waiting room.
She's in the waiting room. Okay, let me, for some reason my waiting room is not open. Here we go, yeah. Okay, I let them in. So let me say a few words before we get into the text about reading these kinds of texts. First of all, these texts are not normal. This is not what you and I spend our day reading. This is not news. This is not a story written by someone, you know, yesterday. This is not intended for you to ever have read it, right? This was written for an audience that is long dead, in a language that is no longer used and was translated, in a historical circumstance that you and I can barely, even if we were to spend our entire lives studying the period in which Copernicus lived and worked, we would still barely understand, really what it was like to live at that time and all the kinds of considerations that people had and the significance of many things. So when you approach a text like this, you should approach it as something that is not familiar and kind of like you're meeting someone and you don't know where they're from, what language they speak, or anything about them, right? And you have to kind of start at the beginning, you know? You look at them, you get an impression, you might try to ask them where they're from, and they don't speak your language. Now you're in trouble, right? These books do not speak your language. They look like they speak your language. In fact, they have been packaged to feel familiar to you. Things have been put in them. This is the problem with editors. Editors love to package texts for you as if you are not smart enough to read them yourselves. So they do all kinds of things to make you feel more comfortable. They insert titles, they change phrases and so on to update them, make them more contemporary. In that process, they largely falsify, though, and often dangerously so, certain texts, right? So when you approach these, you know, you really do have to approach it as something foreign and look at all parts. And one thing that's different about all the texts that we'll read today and in the future in this course is that people of other periods read books in different ways. Books had different purposes. In the time that Copernicus wrote, books were a relatively new thing. What do I mean, books were a relatively new thing? Weren't books around since the ancients? So how can I say
that can be read by others, like are accessible to others.
So, yeah, I mean, even the form of the book was relatively new, although you had in ancient times, you'd have scrolls, right? They would keep them on scrolls and so on. But that's the least important thing. The printing press, as you all know, is in the 1400s, invented in the 1400s, and it had very little impact in that time. By the time Copernicus in 1543 is writing, is almost actually really at the beginning of the real influence of the printing press. Now think about what the printing press is and does, and the way it was before. Before, books were hand copied, right, by experts. The vast majority of the population could not read or write. This was true for thousands of years in the West, right? They could not read or write. The only people who read or write were very specialized, educated individuals, and they read and wrote in Latin. There wasn't even, except in rare cases, there wasn't even a standard way of writing down many languages, right? So like ancient Germanic, they had symbols and things, but there wasn't a standard alphabet that was being used or spelling or anything like that. People didn't use those things. So there wasn't even really an adequate way to record normal languages, but Latin was well developed from ancient times, and it was written down and used by scholars. And those scholars, as I said, copied them by hand. The value of a book was more than most people would make in a lifetime in terms of wealth and value. So books were not for the public. They were personal property, and many of them were held very secretively. If you want a good kind of contemporary idea, an explanation of what medieval libraries were like, some of you have heard of a book called The Name of the Rose, maybe? It's a novel, 20 years old or something. It's very entertaining. You should read it. It's like a detective, like a Sherlock Holmes story set in a medieval monastery, right? And it's very cool because you learn all about medieval life and the monastery and so on. And it's also exciting, and there's murders and all these wonderful things that we like. But it's partially about a library, the main library of the monastery. And as you'll learn there were teams of copyists. They would copy these books. They were sworn to silence. They couldn't talk about what was in the books. When the books were copied, they were put in the library, and only 1 or 2 people in the monastery had access to the library. And if you ever wanted to read a book, you needed special permission from someone higher up. And there were books that were like kept but permanently out of circulation. You couldn't borrow a book, that's for sure. You couldn't take it out of the library. So knowledge, the way books and book, there was no book trade, there was no selling of books. They were kept in these very secretive libraries, right? Access only to scholars. With the printing press, that absolutely explodes, right? Now, when the printing press is created, that's not going to have much effect, is it? Because people can't read or write, so what's the point? So it came in for very specific purposes, generally two. The main first purpose of the printing press is propaganda. The Protestant Reformation would not have happened without the printing press. Luther used the printing press to print all kinds of 1-2-page pamphlets expressing his ideas to the public, right? And as the public slowly, as there was more material available, the public became more interested in learning to read and write. And as the public became more interested in reading and writing, there was more reason to use a printing press. So it took time for this mutual development. But by the time Copernicus is around, the printing press has really become not just it wasn't there for education. That was a side product. It was there either for spreading of ideas for political, religious, propaganda purposes, or to make money. That is, by the time of Copernicus, that is the main purpose of printing presses. It's part of the mercantile, class. They own printing presses. They search for books by authors that are going to sell well. Books are expensive still, they're very expensive, but they are affordable to people with money, and people are gradually getting more money in this period as nobility is kind of losing its influence and so on. And the mercantile class, trade booms all over Europe. More people have more money to spend on things. And what do? You want to have the latest books in your house so that you impress all your friends, right? And you have Copernicus's book, and you have other books on, also people were very interested in self-help books, as they still are today. But those self-help books in the period were things like how to improve your memory, how to, alchemy, like how to do magic, and make lots of money by, having special symbol systems and all kinds of weird mystical stuff. Just like today, like people trying to sell you a pill that will make you intelligent or whatever. People will make up all kinds of junk, but this was in the book community. They would sell all this kind of junk because it sold well. And printers loved it. And there were big centers all over Europe that printed. And they tended to be, of course, what sells? We all know what sells. What sells? Stuff that is either outrageous,
controversial,
yes, exactly. So what did printers do? Well, for one thing, they set up their printing press in a part of Europe that was particularly tolerant. So lots of presses in Holland and in Switzerland. And they searched for books that would become immediately famous and controversial, right? Either controversial, or they were like these books on how to become a genius and remember everything, right? Or whatever. So people wanted to buy Copernicus's book, and people wanted him to publish it simply because they knew it would be controversial. But that wasn't why he published it. And we'll see in the text that this is an important consideration for him. There are lots of people publishing crazy crap trying to become famous and to make a lot of money. And so Copernicus has to tell everyone, particularly the religious authorities, this was the least thing from my mind, right? Other people urged me. I didn't want to become famous or to sell books or anything. I actually wrote this book a long time ago, just as a manuscript, and I held on to it for a long time. And it was only at the urging of people within the church, friends of mine, who said, don't let your knowledge die with you, who convinced me to get it out. That's one of the things he's going to talk about. But that makes a lot of sense. Now, this idea about money and printing, it's still today, but you and I tend to forget it. All these books you buy, I'm sure as students you're aware, textbooks, money making. Why do you think there are 80 editions of the biology textbook you used in high school? So they could change the edition every year, so you had to buy a new edition, right? Those companies actually actively buy back those books to destroy them, so that people don't use them again, right? The guy who wrote one of the most famous college books on biology has like a house with a built-in symphony orchestra thing, right? Like he's a multi-millionaire. So books are big business. As you can see also, this is one of the great things. Everybody loves Donald Trump because everybody's writing a book about him and making millions of dollars. Controversy, right? But you can't, you should keep this in mind even for like things like Copernicus or literature. You know, why are the books of, you ever noticed how long the books of Charles Dickens are? Or how long the books by Dostoevsky? Why? They were paid by the chapter. They essentially what they did in those times, like A Christmas Carol by Dickens, that was a money-making scheme. He said, he self-published it so he could get all the profits. But what would they do? They would basically, it would be like a subscription. Like you subscribe to a magazine, you would subscribe to Charles Dickens' publisher and ask that his latest novel, you would get the chapters every couple weeks. And for each chapter, you would pay a fee, right? And often on the backs of those chapters, when they printed them, would be the list of subscribers. So also people could see that you were one of those wealthy people who subscribed, right? All your friends subscribed, they'd be on the back cover or whatever. And he was paid by the chapter, and the more chapters there were, the more times he got paid, right? So that's why you get a 600-page book. But anyways, same thing for Dostoevsky, same thing. So just don't forget about this. You see this when we open up the first page of Copernicus's book, right? With the note to the diligent reader, straight off says, therefore, buy, read, and enjoy this work. Right? The publisher put this here. He wants you to buy the work. This would have been printed a very beautiful book, right? Leather binding, nice, anything with like prints or pictures. These would be very nicely done and be very valuable. They love these big books with diagrams and things because this could show off really what the printing press could do, and you could charge a lot of money for them. So diagrams and so on. Now, one other thing about, so when you, to come back to the main point, when you read this text, all of these kinds of new kinds of considerations of the period should be in your mind. Also, don't assume that you understand, although this is in English, that's one of those things. This was not written in English, right? Translation is terribly complicated. Translation is often incorrect. If you and I were experts of Latin and Greek, we would go through this text and we would probably find lots of mistakes and things. And we would also find things that are just not quite right or not quite accurate. So you have to keep in mind you're reading it in English, but also you're reading it in an English that is greatly influenced by the language from which it was translated. That's a bit weird. So you're going to find a lot of words here that are English words that are not used in the way that we use those English words now. So never assume that you know what something says, and if it sounds really weird or wrong, it might be, right? You can do a lot of research, and I'll flag these things, but this is one of the skills you need to know about when you're reading any historical text. We're going to see this right from the beginning, but a last point about reading these ancient texts or these older texts is that today you and I read books in a certain way. If you read a book, if you buy a book, do you read the introduction?
No, not often.
Rarely, right? Rarely.
I have a question though.
What?
I have a question. Is
Yeah.
that the book you were talking about has an introduction written by his friend?
The foreword is written by his friend. We're going to see that.
Because it seems so much different than the other pages that come after.
It is very different, and we'll see how it's different and go through that in some detail. going back to the point, we today don't usually read introductions or read them well. We consider them secondary. And authors know this, right? Any good author understands the medium in which they're writing. If they're writing on the internet, if they're writing in a newspaper, if they're writing a poem, if they're writing a short story, they're writing a novel, they know their medium well, and they try to exploit your expectations, right? That's what genres of literature and certain forms of literature do. They set expectations for you. You and I today expect the introduction to be something we can probably skip. So authors writing today shouldn't put anything really important in the introduction. They would be well advised not to, and if they know their audience and their form, they shouldn't. That is not true in the period of Copernicus. And throughout all this entire course, you'll find most people read very little and read with difficulty. People who are, well, we're gonna talk about that in a minute, but many people who read it are not gonna read more than the title page, let alone the foreword, maybe the foreword and the introduction, and then that's where they're gonna stop, right? Importantly, there's one group of people who will probably only do that,